Hello and welcome to our standard interview format. In most interviews, I start with a little bit of a welcome, and obviously I would need to introduce myself. Then typically would cut to one of our guests and I would ask that guest to introduce himself or herself, before then cutting to whichever other guests I have to appear, and also introducing these guests and asking them to say a little bit about themselves. We would then typically have a little bit of an introduction to the topics that we're going to cover before then transitioning to the actual debate format. On top of that, we can have newsroom style banners at the bottom of the screen, which could include the headline or topic for debate, plus a certain amount of text scrolling beneath this. We try not to rely too heavily on the text that appears at the bottom of the screen for the messaging and the storytelling. This is done far more effectively with lively discussion between the participants. And again, during this discussion, we could quote a whole host of different facts and figures, but people are unlikely to retain these. It's far more effective, we find, to use storytelling techniques incorporating anecdotes. For example, I could tell you that a cyber incident was a far more serious incident for a company than a flood or a fire or a financial one, and that these need to be treated very differently. You may believe me, you may remember what I say, but I think it's unlikely. But if I tell you an anecdote, if I say, imagine a bank is held up at gunpoint, everyone can understand that the villains in this scenario were the people holding the guns, and the victims in the scenario are the bank and its clients. The way that people see this after the fact in the press and in public opinion, they tend to identify villains and victims. In this case, it would be very clear that if you put forward an executive to show empathy with all of the victims, the bank staff and its customers, they will turn that empathy into sympathy, and they will sympathize with the brand and the company, and they will see the people who held the robbery and the staff at gunpoint as the villains. If you had the same bank, but it suffered a cyber incident, in this case, it's not immediately obvious who the villains are because you don't necessarily know who the hackers were or when the hack occurred. And therefore, unusually, it is the bank itself that is seen as the villain for not actually having prevented the incident. Therefore, if you put forward an executive showing empathy and hoping to get sympathy in return, you're simply not going to work, and your spokesperson is going to be shot down in flames. Indeed, a cyber incident is almost the only kind of crime that we can think of where a company or a brand that has been the victim of a crime is actually perceived by the press and the public as the villain in the scenario for not having prevented it. Now, by telling an anecdote in that way, I will be able to get a point across, but it will also be retained by the audience, and indeed, I bet that you and anyone listening to that anecdote would actually be able to retell the anecdote to other people and would remember it sometime later in a way that they would never remember facts or figures. On top of that, if we want to direct them in a particular direction, and indeed if we want them to follow a link, we can also overlay a QR code where they can pause the video and where they can hold up their phone and they get a link automatically from this. We find that a combination of using QR codes and really strong anecdotes will get a message across far more effectively.